Before diving into this incredible story, remember to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here, every story has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. In a chic Manhattan restaurant, the air was thick with an air of elegance and self-importance. The waiters moved with mechanical precision, the immaculate white tablecloths reflected the light from the crystal chandeliers, and the patrons, upper-class faces with polished smiles, seemed to think themselves untouchable. Among them, a white man in his 50s, named Richard Thompson, sipped his cocktail, observing his surroundings with a sly smile. When Jasmine Carter, an elegant and self-assured black woman, entered to dine alone, Richard couldn't help but stare at her with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. To him, she was easy prey, a moment of power to wield. When she politely requested a table by the window, Richard made a haughty gesture and murmured for the waiter to hear. "You can seat this lady wherever you want. But not here." He thought this small act of humiliation would go unnoticed, that no one would care about her, and that his sense of superiority would remain intact. But he was unaware of several things. Jasmine was no ordinary woman. Behind her calm smile hid a formidable intelligence and a reputation that, if tested, could turn his life upside down. No sooner had Richard turned his head to sip his drink than the waiter, hesitating, gave him a meaningful look. Jasmine sat down, certain of her right to be treated with respect. And in that sparkling room, what seemed to be a mere social affront would transform into a lesson Richard would never forget. The restaurant, La Magnolia, located in the heart of Manhattan, was a haven of understated luxury. The immaculate white tablecloths, the shimmering chandeliers, and the hushed murmur of conversations gave the impression that time stood still. Yet, that evening, the atmosphere was about to change dramatically. Richard Thompson, a white man in his 50s with a smug look, sat in a corner of the room, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He observed the customers with a mixture of condescension and curiosity, like a predator sizing up its prey. When Jasmine Carter, an elegant and refined black woman, entered, Richard couldn't help but stare at her with a smirk. Jasmine, dressed in a simple yet sophisticated gown, walked confidently towards the hostess. Her step was sure, each movement measured, as if she were perfectly in control of her surroundings. She asked politely, "A table by the window, please." Richard, thinking of a little power game, whispered loudly enough for the waiter to hear. "You can seat this lady wherever you want. Not here." He expected a whisper of complicity, an admiring glance from his peers. But nothing. The waiter, uncomfortable, nodded slightly and complied, while Jasmine smiled faintly, but her composure masked a watchful attention. She discreetly took out her phone and began filming, her eyes never leaving Richard. What he took for a minor, harmless humiliation was about to become the beginning of his nightmare. The murmurs around them grew louder, and some customers exchanged intrigued glances. Richard, convinced of his impunity, raised his glass to mask his discomfort, unaware that Jasmine had already taken control of the situation. In this glittering and pretentious restaurant, the power game had only just begun, and Richard was about to discover that underestimating someone could be very costly. Only a few minutes had passed since the incident, and Richard Thompson was beginning to feel slightly uneasy. He couldn't understand why the waiter, usually so accustomed to his arrogance, seemed hesitant. And why were some customers looking at him with such insidious curiosity? Meanwhile, Jasmine Carter calmly sipped her water, her phone discreetly placed on the table in front of her. She hadn't shouted, she hadn't protested, she had simply registered every detail: Richard's gesture, his contemptuous murmurs, his condescending smile. She knew exactly what she was doing. The restaurant manager, a tall and imposing man named Daniel Brooks, approached Richard with a polite but firm smile. "Mr. Thompson, may I speak with you for a moment?" Richard, surprised by the audacity of the question, frowned. "What is this about?" he asked in a deceptively calm voice. Daniel took out his phone and placed it in front of him. The screen showed the video that Jasmine had just filmed, capturing every gesture of Richard with embarrassing precision. This video will be posted on our social media if we are unable to resolve this misunderstanding. You understand the consequences, don't you? Richard felt an icy chill run down his spine. The power he thought he possessed had just vanished. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. His entire plan to humiliate him had just backfired. Jasmine, for her part, remained perfectly calm, her gaze direct and assured. She didn't need to shout or provoke, her dignity and control of the situation were enough to make Richard vulnerable. Behind his icy smile, Richard understood that this was not just a social humiliation. It was the beginning of a lesson he would pay dearly for, a lesson that would extend far beyond this luxurious restaurant. The next day, Richard Thompson woke up with a strange feeling of unease. The previous day's incident already seemed to be spiraling out of control. He had always believed that his status and social network would have protected him, but now he was discovering how much he had underestimated Jasmine Carter. On his phone, he discovered a flood of notifications. The video filmed by Jasmine was circulating rapidly on social media. Each share, each comment, each like transformed his arrogant gesture into a public humiliation. Colleagues he thought were loyal sent him cautious messages, some ironic, others frankly critical. The atmosphere in his office had changed. His colleagues' stares weighed heavily on him, some exchanging whispers that Richard couldn't hear but perfectly understood. He felt the first real panic of his life. His image, which he thought was solid, was cracking at a speed he couldn't control. Meanwhile, Jasmine calmly continued her life. She had anticipated this response, but never to excess. Every move was measured, every gesture strategic. She knew that patience and dignity were her most powerful weapons. Richard tried to fight back. He sent messages to his influential friends, tried to convince the restaurant to remove the video, but every attempt backfired. Social media, hungry for justice and tales of revenge, amplified his humiliation instead of containing it. At the end of the day, he realized it wasn't just a simple social incident, his arrogance had triggered a chain reaction he could no longer control. And deep down, he knew Jasmine was only just beginning to pull the strings. The bitter taste of his defeat was beginning to set in. He had wanted to humiliate someone to feel powerful. Ironically, he was the one who found himself trapped. A few weeks after the incident at the restaurant, Richard Thompson felt his life taking a turn he never could have imagined. The incessant calls from his colleagues and the anonymous messages flooding his inbox constantly reminded him that his arrogant act could no longer be undone. Jasmine's video had gone viral, and now even the local media were picking up the story. His company, a reputable consulting firm, summoned Richard for an emergency meeting with the CEO and the board of directors. The impassive faces that greeted him in the conference room barely betrayed their disapproval. The CEO, in a grave tone, declared, "Mr. Thompson, your actions have severely damaged our company's image. We must take action." Richard tried to justify himself, to downplay the incident, but every word seemed to fall on deaf ears. The video, publicly released and analyzed by everyone, left no room for excuses. He then understood that his reputation, built on years of arrogance and power, was crumbling. Meanwhile, Jasmine continued her life with serenity. She had shown that humiliation never goes unpunished when the person targeted possesses dignity and intelligence. She had used her patience and strategy to turn the situation around without ever losing her composure. A few days later, Richard lost his management position and his professional credibility was irreparably damaged. His social relationships deteriorated, and he realized, too late, that the contempt he had thought would go unpunished had come at a price. Jasmine, for her part, remained a respected and admired figure in her community. Her calm, her confidence, and her quiet strength had triumphed over arrogance and discrimination. In that Manhattan restaurant, what seemed to be a minor affront became a universal lesson: respect and dignity always prevail over arrogance and humiliation. And Richard, alone facing the consequences of his actions, knew that he could never forget the woman he had thought he had humiliated without consequence.